Peps Bed Talks. Ideas worth the snoring. Tonight's bed talk: biodiversity of snails in forest ecosystems of Brazil. The biodiversity of Brazil needs no introduction, as it is renowned for its mega diversity of animal species, harboring a significant portion of Earth's most populated ecosystems. Still, the Brazilian land snail fauna is not that diverse at first sight, comprising around 700 native species. Land snails are mollusks, a group that includes snails of the sea, clams, octopus, and squid. Land snails breathe air. Their distant marine and freshwater snail cousins breathe through gills. Land snails live in damp places, in leaf litter, under old logs, and in the top layer of soil, and are generally believed to be ground-dwelling creatures, preferring dark and humid places like the forest floor. Most of these species were described by European and North American naturalists based on material obtained during 19th century expeditions. For naturalists of keen pursuit, Brazil has always offered the luxury of observing several distinctive biomes, such as the Atlantean forest and the La Sorsa, biomes that typically exhibit high degrees of endemicity. Early 20th century malacologists also made remarkable contributions to the study of land snails in the country, but they were still mostly from Europe and the USA. One Brazilian naturalist, however, deserves a spotlight during this period: Hermann von Straub. Born in Germany, von Straub moved to Brazil in 1895 and eventually became the director of the Zoology Museum of Sao Paulo in 1902. He published articles on recent and fossil animals, mollusks and vertebrates alike, and had contact with many malacologists and paleontologists worldwide, such as Florentino Armanda in Argentina and Henry Sinclair in Australia. Early 20th century malacologists like Philadelphia-based Henry Pillsbury also made remarkable contributions to the study of land snails in the country. From that point onwards, however, there was relatively little interest in Brazilian land snails until very recently. The last decade sparked a renewed enthusiasm in this branch of malacology, and over 50 new Brazilian species were revealed. An astounding portion of the known species, around 45%, presently belongs to the superfamily Orthallusia, a group of mostly tree snails with typically large and colorful shells. In fact, several of the species discovered in the last decade belong to these low-profile groups, and many come from scarcely studied regions or environments, such as caverns and islands. These places still undoubtedly hide many surprises for malacologists, and there is still a long way to go until we have a good understanding of the terrestrial gastropod fauna in Brazil. The science behind this venture, however, is still underfunded and moving at a snail's pace. This is especially unsettling, as land snails are deemed one of the animal groups most vulnerable to extinction, and the overly exploited natural environments in Brazil might not last long, especially considering the country's recent environmentally harmful policies. The term land snails does not refer to a natural group in evolutionary terms. Rather, it includes lineages belonging to distinct gastropod subclasses that colonized the terrestrial environment independently from one another. The vast majority of land snails, though, belongs to a single larger group, known colloquially as pulmonates. In most cases worldwide, The bulk of gastropod diversity lies within pulmonates, but some other lineages, like the helicinids, can also be remarkably diverse. The number of known species of terrestrial gastropods worldwide sits around 25,000, but it is widely expected that this number will increase as new species are discovered. Researchers consider that there is a certain urgency in discovering and describing new land snail species because they and their freshwater counterparts likely have the highest extinction rate of all animal groups. Unlike invasive snails that feed on crops, native land snails occupy an important position in the food web, near the bottom. Native land snails' diets consist of moss and decaying vegetation. Hence, they serve as cleanup crews of the ecosystem, gleaning calcium and other vital nutrients from decomposing matter. They in turn become an important food for so many animals, including many species of insects, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals. The effect of climate change was investigated by examining the composition, richness and diversity, also known as the Shannon Index, of land snail species in relation to habitat and landscape structure. 13 macro snail species were recorded in total, and rarefied species richness and diversity at restored landfill sites was not found to be statistically different from that of reference sites. 1/3 of the snail species at restored landfill sites, accounting for 30% of their total abundance, were non-native species. Soil electrical conductivity was the strongest predictor of richness and diversity of land snails. Tree density was found to be positively related to snail species diversity. Given the high percentage of introduced species at study sites, further research is needed to elucidate management implications of restored landfill sites and dynamics of native versus non-native species. Snail diversity, often associated with high levels of snail endemism, is therefore clearly concentrated in tropical rainforests. Fragmentation, loss and transformation of tropical forests and the introduction of alien species have caused most of the current wave of snail extinctions, and many snail faunas are threatened. In addition to being of considerable value as sensitive indicators of habitat quality and indicators of centers of biotic diversity and endemism, by any measure, land snails are a high priority for conservation in their own right. The research also focused on certain species of tree-climbing land snails. These snails, called Eudora sapori, live in a small area in the southern parts of the rainforest, full of trees such as oak and maple. During winter, the snails hibernate on the ground in the leaf litter, moving into the treetops in the spring and then coming back down to earth in autumn. To find out why the snails leave the dark, humid earth for the light, dry canopy, scientists observed the snails in the trees from tall observation towers as well as on the ground during different seasons of the year. They compared the snails' activities with those of the ground-dwelling cadabine beetle, known to eat land snails. The temperature and humidity of the tree canopy was measured and compared to that of the ground. They also devised a clever way to compare survival rates of snails in the trees and on the ground. Snails were collected from the forest and taken back to the laboratory, where a piece of string was tied securely around the shell. The snails were then returned to the forest and either tethered high up to trees or to the ground. To work out what the snails eat The researchers analyzed the carbon and nitrogen ratios in their bodies and compared them to other land-dwelling snails who lived in the same forest. It turns out that by climbing into the trees in early spring, the snails avoid being eaten by the beetles, who are most active in summer. In fact, the survival rates of the snails in the trees were remarkably higher than those on the ground. In some cases, almost double at the end of the 2-week experiment. The menu in the treetops is different to that on the ground too. The tissue analysis of the snails revealed that tree-dwelling snails most likely eat lichens and mosses that are abundant in the canopy, whereas the ground-dwelling snails eat forest leaf litter. The results of this research have been published recently in the leading international journal, the Journal of Snail Behavior, Volume 64, Issue 9, Section 2, pages 245 to 571. According to the research paper, recent revisions tend to clean up the taxonomy of a given group and reduce the apparent biodiversity due to synonymization. Consequently, it is possible that the present number of land species in Brazil will simultaneously shrink and grow, as old species are placed in synonymy and new ones are discovered. Despite fabulous adaptations to land, snails are among the most sensitive animals to pollutants, including road runoff and acidic rainfall. Land snail populations have dwindled in recent decades, in turn contributing to the decline of certain bird species. When we think of animal and ecosystem conservation, we should include land snails. Presently, there are circa 700 native species described from Brazil. However, a more down-to-earth assessment needs to consider the lack of revisionary studies that aimed to determine the taxonomic validity of all these species. Some families indeed have been revised since Pillsbury's Manual of Conchology. Even so, at current estimates, it would take us more than 3 centuries to describe every species of land snails found in the Brazilian peninsula. A snail space indeed. Hello, are you there? Still awake? Really? Perhaps we need to find something infinitely more tedious to overcome your incredible tolerance for auditory boredom. Or perhaps your wakefulness has less to do with the lockdown and more to do with your mattress. In which case, may we suggest that when things get back to normal, you visit a Peps Great Sleep store near you. You'll find simpler ways to fall asleep.